I want you guys to please make him feel very, very welcome. He's going to talk about the state of economic risk. Put your hands together for Nick Cannon.
Hello, my name is Nick, as mentioned. I'm going to talk about the state of economic risk. I work at Gauntlet. We provide financial modeling solutions built sort of using TradFi techniques to help DeFi protocols understand and mitigate those risks. The applied research team that sort of leads a lot of this research is thinking about novel primitives and mechanism design, and that informs a lot of the modeling and simulations that we do. We work with protocols and DAOs like Aave and Compound and large delegates and active in sort of the governance ecosystem as mentioned in L2s like Arbitrum. So straight out of the way, economic and ecosystem exploits by risk category. As you can sort of see, the notional amount lost to economic exploits is more than security and governance exploits combined. Hacks and exploits commonly classified as security, oracle, governance, or economic, also known as market risk, what is often surprising is the disproportionate attention given to sort of the left side of this slide, the security and governance, the classic hacks, the governance rug pulls, and similar, whereas we can see notionally on the right, just in size and quantity, economic exploits are quite frequent and large. Today we'll run through sort of one big happy ecosystem, sort of where it all came from, permissionless ecosystems, where they're sort of evolving, PVE, not player versus environment, maybe protocol versus ecosystem, and what's next. All started sort of one big happy ecosystem, Ethereum and all. This is a snapshot of the loans ending in 2018. Not my current gig in DeFi, the previous one. We sort of put this report together. As you can see, you can sort of fit DeFi lending in one little donut, and it was a stretch at that. Compound, Dharma, and DYDX. Really wasn't PvP back then. Dharma had a P2P lending model, which is having its sort of comeback right now. Compound has the dominant model that we've all sort of seen, forked endlessly, et cetera. What they're really just trying to find is not compete with each other, but really find if there was users, product market fit, et cetera. If you map sort of DeFi's S-curve today in this classic technological eruption disruption cycle, you might categorize it something like this. First, there was eruption. DeFi summer kicked off with Compound and its token. Frenzy, where forks and TVL growth were anchored by Sushi's Vampire Tech, 500 plus forks of Compound and Uniswap alone. A synergy, protocol deployments sort of across networks. Aave, Uniswap in 2021 went to Polygon, and then other L2s as well. And then this very much spurred consolidation. And then sort of maturity, not maturity for the end of DeFi or the end of crypto, but just sort of at the stage we're at in this sort of life cycle. The winning DAOs go vertical. Aave and Curve design stablecoins. Maker has a lending protocol. Uniswap does NFTs. Synthetics does perpetuals. Lending coming into 2023 sort of looked like this, mentioning the forks, the bottom two, the biggest plus on this graph, the charcoal and the sort of the light blue are Compound and Aave, very commonly forked. Had over 90% of market share at the beginning of 2021, but coming into 2023, while that had receded a little bit, they still have only about 80%. At mid-early 2022, they had lost a little bit sort of across chain where they had yet to deploy. But as we see, sort of they've been able to abate a lot of these forks and attacks on their market share. You see a similar pattern for DEXs, most notably Uniswap and all its forks. Uniswap didn't deploy, as mentioned, to Polygon until 2021, but starting at 70% in early 2021 of market share, and then down to as low as like 30% for sort of AMMs of the V2 and V3 flavor that are using their contracts. Towards the end of, or coming into 2023, and even now, we've seen them gain that market share back. This big charcoal block still in the middle is PancakeSwap on BSC. Uniswap just in March had deployed to Binance. And if they do sort of, or if we see a similar pattern of that when they deployed on Polygon, we should sort of expect them to regain that 2/3 market share, or at least they hope. So why are we talking about consolidation, S-curves, and protocols? I thought this was about ecosystems. Well, there's sort of things to learn. The market structure of these protocols actually informs how these ecosystems evolve, and like where protocol devs, the next ones building their next deployments or the new primitives, actually think about deploying. It doesn't have to be on mainnet anymore. Two or three things inform this. Market-leading protocols sort of have proven resilient to disruption and long-tail fragmentation. Protocol consolidation without M&A, it's really tough to do protocol M&A and DAOs, and there's been very few attempts at that. Reveals traits of winner-take-most outcomes. It's tough to expect TradFi to sort of look like, or DeFi to look like TradFi in the end. Will there be 50 to 60 sort of global exchanges with stable market share? Maybe, probably not. And then the market instability, hinders ourselves, Gauntlet, and other service providers to drive value across multiple segments, but this also goes for ecosystems and their DAOs. How do they think about blue chips versus new entrants? So, aren't these permissionless ecosystems? Yes, sort of. Want to talk about the frameworks? A lot of people throw risk frameworks out there, how to classify, how to segment these different risks. And the reason this obviously matters is like if you're trying to think about ecosystem goals and needs, where do you allocate them? How do you get visibility into what is the biggest pain point for your users? And of course, like the protocols building on top of you. I generally classify it, without getting too philosophical about the debate, but an ecosystem risk is anything that touches multiple protocols. This is very commonly known or seen through flash loans, the mechanism that basically allows for you to borrow in an atomic transaction certain collateral from an Aave, a lending protocol, and then use it elsewhere to borrow or trade or something similar. So sure, there's risk, but so what? A few reasons this actually matters to ecosystems. One, they're fragile. As I'll show in future slides, market share concentration is high to extreme in really all categories. Categories being lending, DEX, and CDP, and synthetics, and things like that. Switching costs are very low. The UX might be bad, but if users can bridge in or on to your L2 or your chain, they can definitely bridge out. And while the barriers to entry or the switching costs are a little bit higher for protocols, we've seen cross-chain deployments pretty easily. It takes a little bit more thought than a few transactions, but definitely doable. And also, liquidity breeds liquidity. This is sort of tried and true from traditional finance, but definitely here and exists now. Permissionless composability can, of course, accelerate growth, but also introduce systemic risk. So what does this look like across these ecosystems? Sort of chose 5 and wanted to benchmark against Ethereum a little bit. What you can see is the traction, so sort of on the x-axis, you're going to see time, obviously, and then on the y-axis, you're going to see concentration of the top 4 protocols that are market risk-bearing. So what we're excluding here primarily is AMMs. While obviously the liquidity is extremely important, they aren't parameterized generally. A forked V2 Uniswap contract isn't really adding measurable or anything more than negligible risk to a new ecosystem. So the categories being sort of plotted here are primarily lending, CDP, synthetics, and derivatives. You can sort of see concentrations all over the place. It's not extremely stable, up and down. Arbitrum seeing a dip and sort of heading in the right direction post token launch. Optimism as well, but they would admit in the retro they did in their governance forum that they probably overspent for this. They paid a lot in allocations and there wasn't a lot of accountability. Binance is a little bit deceiving in the sense that majority of the liquidity on those chains are DEXs and launchpads. Market concentration, as mentioned before, is definitely key. So again, on the y-axis, you have the top 4 protocols by each category, and HHI, or Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, is a common concentration metric. So what this does in other sectors is basically compare how to reason about stability and how you should think about, at least for ecosystems, what is driving your value and your users and that traction. Everything below, for the most part, DEX is an aggregator, so the only thing below 75% concentration. Everything else where services is sort of the middleware layer anchored by the Instapp, CDP and Maker, synthetics of synthetics, algo stablecoins up in the top right, anchored by Frax, As you can see, these are very concentrated. By traditional market standards, anything above 2,500 is considered concentrated. Above 5,000 is just extreme. This makes it tough to plan, and it makes it tough to have a competitive advantage, but also tough to allocate resources. One thing I want to touch on, as previously shown, is Oracle versus market manipulation. Market manipulation really just involves trying to move the prices of an asset. In traditional finance, a lot of this is illegal. There's descriptions like banging the close, where you're manipulating an underlying asset. And Oracle exploits mainly involves bad pricing data. Security audits are for the category leading protocols are very high. As you can see, Lido with 8. This is Aave on the right with 9. Now, granted, these are for different parts of the code base and different versions, but for category leadership, these protocols are understanding that redundancy is actually needed, and the incremental value here is extremely, extremely valuable. Unfortunately, smaller protocols really can't afford this. How do they think about the incremental dollar chain that they should spend? Should they spend it on UX? Should they spend it on marketing? And this goes into how they think about deploying to new ecosystems. When they get that traction, will they get that incremental audit when it actually matters more? Back to the chart from the beginning, now that we sort of understand this breakdown, you sort of want to think of how should an ecosystem who has funds, wants to think about public goods, wants to think about standing up sub-DAOs, where they should direct their intention. Is this sort of a snapshot in time? We see all these audits have already happened, but is security and governance solved? Is this like a 2018-19 problem? What is it having now? Are all these economic risk and exploits new? Should we focus on that now? Well, actually not. Plotted over time, the blue being in economic and the orange for security, this actually shows pretty consistent over 2.5 years, both in, as mentioned before, size and count. PvE, rather than player versus environment, protocol versus ecosystem. Now, of course, there's tons of synergies and alignments. Protocols want novel primitives. They want their protocol or ecosystems want novel primitives. They want them to be successful, but those don't match one-to-one. I don't think anyone would exactly expect users, protocols, and ecosystems to have perfect alignment, but there's probably not enough attention to the weight that protocols are throwing around. They get a lot of a lot of incentives. They have delegation power. They have other options in the space and in different time horizons they're operating under. For example, the goals of the Arbitrum DAO, recently spun up, about 3 months old. I read a few hundred delegate platforms, and these sort of sum up to 2 main buckets: growth and decentralization. Attracting builders, onboarding new users, being efficient and sustainable, decentralization for fairness, transparency, to foster education and avoid conflicts. This seems kind of obvious, but how do you go about doing that? Back to what is the biggest problem? How do you understand the sustainable competitive advantage that makes sense to deploy what is a multi-billion-dollar treasury? When I talk about stability, other industries do this as well. This is an analysis of the US auto industry, and what you're trying to look at is the absolute average value change over time, usually in more stable industries. This is 3 and 5 year trailing. And what you can sort of tell, anything below sort of 1%, which is about where US auto lands, is considered stable. Or under 2%, sorry. US auto is at about 1%. As you might guess, DeFi is not exactly like that. So this is what DeFi looks like, even when we shorten the time span to 1 month and 3 months. This is the top 15 protocols. Now, they're not exactly, sorry, the axes got a little muddy, but same on the time, and then this mid part is between 10 and 30%, the majority of the fluctuations. So what you're seeing is how this tracks over time. The biggest protocols really aren't worried about market share per se, as they would in US autos and sort of a more predictable, sustainable industry. The TAM of today is definitely not the TAM of next year, or at least they're not building with that in mind. But this makes it tough for ecosystems and their communities and DAOs to reason about who is going to hold the top dog, who's going to hold the top spot. If I spend incentives or if I build public goods thinking around derivatives on Arbitrum, will they be here and will this be our competitive edge in a year's time? So what's an ecosystem to do? A few options here. They can kingmake by attempting to increase the stability for existing blue chips, right? The blue chips got them their early traction. They want to keep them there. Obviously, they have other options. They want to lose them because blue chips attract sort of the other smaller protocols that want to sort of feed off of and have a symbiotic sort of relationship with those users and liquidity. This is like a GMX example where the GLP token is used across 6 other protocols, at least in size, from options and other derivatives. That feels a little bit like DAO reg capture, so that puts a lot of bad taste in a lot of their mouths as far as like at the ecosystem level. Second option being to incubate novel primitives by sourcing and subsidizing new protocols and amplifying their exposure. But then you get back to sort of these blue chips, like what would they think of that? As shown, the concentration is extremely high. Does a leading protocol want their DAO that they're deployed on natively to go pursue another protocol in their category? Maybe find 1 or 2, but how many more do they actually want? The third is foster competition, again by allocating resources and facilitating transparency. How should you think about this over time? And that is obviously extremely tough given such a nascent industry. Predictions for what's next. A few takeaways. First, economic exploits are expensive and frequent. The ecosystems and protocol goals aren't always aligned. They mainly are. Up only feels good, but when it's down, you're sort of conserving resources and trying to understand what's next. How does the new deployments work? Retroactive airdrops, et cetera. And then no ecosystem has really won yet. Just to say that everyone has options and they're still considering them. A few predictions. Ecosystems will expand subsidies to balance risk and growth. A lot of the new ones, like Aptos and Sui, are already doing this for sort of subsidizing smart contracts deployments to get people that are in the EVM ecosystems to come over to the Move languages. Conditional permissionless ecosystems, whereas L2s like OP have sort of admitted they've spent a lot of money and not sure they attracted the right users and growth and builders. So it'll always be permissionless, or at least a lot of them will be, but if you come and you want those incentives and you want those resources from sort of the chain or the ecosystem, there's going to be rules, there's going to be accountability, there's going to be milestones and benchmarks for those things. And then continued apps going vertical. They'll continue to do this and wield sort of power over their ecosystem. So instead of ecosystems king-making protocols or apps, it definitely might be the reverse, where the Uniswap and Avi of the world, you'll see how many L2s are in their forum trying to get a deployment before they're even live, some of which are here. Yeah, thank you.